and the enforcement of the Air Passenger Rights Regulation number 261/2004. On behalf of the Council, Mr. Masikas has the floor.
Thank you very much, President. Honourable Members, Commissioner, air travel is a vital transport link for EU citizens. In the European Union, some 918 million passengers travelled by air in 2015. This figure is increasing steadily from year to year. Ryanair has grown to become the largest EU airline by scheduled passengers flown and carried more international passengers in 2015 than any airline in the world. It currently operates from 84 bases connecting 33 countries across Europe and North Africa. The abrupt cancellation in the 6 weeks from September to October 2017 by Ryanair of thousands of its flights in the EU has caused major disturbances for passengers. A large number of them were left stranded at airports, and many had to cancel journeys or reroute their flights. There are complaints that in a number of cases the airline has given little or no notice of such cancellations. Furthermore, there have been claims that the limited information dispensed by the airline with regards to reimbursement, rerouting or return, as well as the right to assistance and the right to compensation, may have been misleading to passengers. It is deeply regrettable that the passengers were left in such a position. Airlines operating in the EU must respect European rules. Air passengers' rights are protected indeed under the EU law. The Flight Compensation Regulation sets a minimum level of quality standards for passenger protection, adding an important citizens' dimension to the liberalisation of the aviation market. When a flight is cancelled, airlines are obliged to inform passengers of their rights. These rights include the right to reimbursement, rerouting or return, as well as the right to care and, in some circumstances, the right to compensation. Any EU airline not adhering to these rules must be held accountable. The national enforcement bodies in each member state must act to verify that airlines are respecting EU rules and that passengers' rights are protected. They must also strive to ensure that passengers are aware of their rights. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed. The Commissioner now has the floor on behalf of the Commission. Commissioner Bulc.
Honourable Members, the Commission wishes to make the following statement on the recent case of Ryanair cancellations. A few days ago, Ryanair publicly announced that it will reduce its operations by cancelling thousands of scheduled flights, disrupting the travel plans of passengers across Europe. First for flights scheduled until the end of October, totalling of 2,100 flights, and then for others due to the operated during the winter season. A very large number of passengers will be affected, and just like all of you, the Commission wants to make sure that those passengers are treated fairly. The EU is the only area in the world where citizens are protected by a full set of passengers' rights, whether they travel by air, rail, ship, bus or coaches. All passengers whose flights are cancelled have a comprehensive set of rights. It is essential that they receive correct and complete information about their rights in order to be able to enforce them. Let me recall that these rights include the right to reimbursement, rerouting or return, as well as the right to care and, in some circumstances, the right to receive financial compensation. The Commission has asked the national authorities to be vigilant on this issue and to try to cooperate with each other in order to ensure that passengers fully benefit from their rights. As guardian of the treaties, the role of the Commission is to oversee and monitor the implementation of EU law in each member state. For this reason, the Commission immediately issued a statement underlining in particular that Ryanair, just like all airlines operating in the EU, must fully comply with EU air passengers' rights. We are in direct contact with all the national enforcement bodies to make sure that passenger rights are respected. And I specifically welcome the enforcement actions already taken by the UK civil aviation authorities and further actions by other civil aviation authorities, including Ireland or Spain. I am also confident that the Irish Civil Aviation Authority will continue to fulfil its oversight obligations and ensure that Ryanair continues to comply with our aviation acquis. President and honourable members, let me also use this opportunity to remind you that in 2016 the Commission issued guidance on the existing rules to make it easier for passengers and national authorities alike. The Commission also proposed to modernise air passengers' rights rules in 2013, a proposal which is currently blocked in Council. I hope that we will soon be able to make progress on this for our passengers travelling across the EU. This incident clearly highlights the need for a modern and robust European regulatory framework. Honourable members, President, the Commission has contacted Ryanair and we expect them to fully comply with its obligations. Together with my colleague, Commissioner Jourova, I have written an official letter to Ryanair to underline our concerns and highlight the obligations under EU law. First, we recalled that passengers must receive correct and complete information about their rights on due time in order to be able to enforce them, including on rerouting and compensation. Second, Ryanair has to ensure that all communication channels are working properly and that passengers can communicate with staff. Third, another important issue is the complaint handling process. Ryanair shall make available on its website the information on its complaint handling process and on the relevant contact addresses where passengers can file claims. I am pleased to report that Ryanair has already responded by giving a number of assurances addressing the issues we have raised. Indeed, for September and October, 98% of affected customers have had their claims processed. For November to March 2018, the figure is at 75%, and we expect this to go up rapidly in the coming weeks. This is a positive development. I will be pursuing my contacts with Ryanair in the Irish Civil Aviation Authority during a visit to Dublin in a few days, and the Commission will of course remain in close contact with all national enforcement bodies to further follow up on this issue. President and honourable members, the single aviation market has many benefits, but also many obligations. We therefore expect all airlines operating in the EU to fully respect European rules.
Thank you very much indeed, Commissioner. Now we move on to the speakers on behalf of the political groups. On behalf of the EPP, Mrs. Clune for 1.5 minutes.
Thank you, President and Commissioner. Thank you for your clarification and for your action in this area in contacting Ryanair. On the 18th of September last, Ryanair suddenly announced flight cancellations, and it was only last Friday, the 29th of September, 11 days later, that we seem to have come to a point where a full clarification on the issue and their passenger rights, what they're entitled to, were communicated directly to them. That followed meetings with the Commission for Aviation Regulation in Ireland, and the UK, and in Spain as well, as you've mentioned. So it took that time to ensure that passenger rights were outlined clearly and communicated to them directly. Now, 261 has been in place since 2004. So we're all well aware of it. I'm sure an airline, a European airline that, as you say, is benefiting from European aviation, from the liberalisation of the European airspace, should have been aware of the issue. And I hope that they have said that they're taking the matter seriously and have put in place strong communications levels now with their customers All this came from what has been described and is a rostering management failure. It's not a safety issue, as some people would like to think or would like to link it to, and we should be clear on that. Flight time regulations were established by these institutions. The amount of time a pilot can fly, and indeed cabin crew can be in the air in one calendar year, was established in an effort to ensure that they remained compliant and continued to remain compliant. Ryanair had a rostering issue, and they had to cancel flights and ensure that they could remain compliant. But the issue is they are compliant, they continue to be compliant, but it does reflect a serious question mark over their management, certainly in their compliance area when it comes to EU rules and regulations.
Thank you very much indeed. On behalf of S&D, Mr. Ertug.
Thank you very much, President. Colleagues, through to March 2018, 20,000 flights are to be cancelled by Ryanair. About 700,000 passengers will be affected by that. And that obviously throws up questions. So, ladies and gentlemen, we need to work out whether passengers' rights are being upheld. Who's going to stump up for cancellation costs? Who is going to ensure that customers are properly made aware? And where was the Irish Aviation Authority? They are ultimately responsible, and it must be made sure that aviation works without friction. Something must have gone wrong somewhere, and the people responsible need to stand to account. Now, why do you need to cancel flights, I wonder? Punctuality needs to go up, well, fine, but we do know that Ryanair, for quite a long time, has not just got good headlines, they've had some pretty bad headlines, particularly when it comes to pilot employment conditions and employment practices for pilots who are only paid when they fly. Mr. President, I do have 2 minutes.
They told me to. But anyway, let me conclude. I
wonder if it's down to the employment conditions. The Commissioner, you in the Commission need to make sure that this is not done on the backs of our friends, the customers, the passengers.
Thank you very much indeed. On behalf of ECR, Mr. Zlotowski, for 1 minute.
Thank you very much, President, Madam Commissioner. There is no doubt about it. Low-cost airlines have played a very important role in promoting air travel. Ryanair is today a leader within the leader of the segment, and it is very important to underscore that this position also entails certain responsibility. The chaos linked to the cancellation of so many flights leads to a lot of worries on the part of passengers, and it is also a challenging situation to many local airports to which these connections are very important. And this is absolutely unacceptable for Ryanair to ignore their obligations, especially as regards alternative rerouting for the passenger. The regulations are stated very clearly, and the passengers must be sure that their rights will be respected. It is up to Madam Commissioner to enforce Article 5 of this regulation, and this is what I would encourage you to do very strongly. I expect that the European Commission will monitor the situation and undertake relevant steps.
Mr. Telička, for 2 minutes on behalf of ALDE.
Thank you, Chair, Madam Commissioner. I'm glad also that we have this point on the agenda in the plenary today and that we can debate it. I think that it's worth saying that clearly something went wrong in Ryanair, and Ryanair, to put it bluntly, has messed up something. I mean, if I were the CEO, I would probably take measures, because the first, of course, affected in this respect is also the company, its businesses, its reputation. So I think no doubt something went wrong, and it's obvious due to the implications that we debated. But I think that the Commissioner has said one important thing, and this is something that we should focus on in terms of where do we go from here on and what is to be the policy making, and that is that the European Union, our internal market, the rights of consumers and passengers' rights, if we compare the situation with any other region in the world, any other country, this is the most protective framework, legislative framework that we have. That goes without saying. And I see also that the Commission has acted, it has a response, so I'm sure that as concerns the competencies of the Commission will make sure that Ryanair does implement what it promised and what it has to implement. And of course we also have the relevant national authorities. What I'm more concerned about is that 10 years since we have this most protective or protection legislative framework, that still there are entities and people that do not know what the passenger rights today are and what can be, let's say, reimbursed, what kind of obligations that the airliner has. That, I think, is something that we need to draw a conclusion on as well. And I hope that apart from the monitoring of implementation, and of course our focus on it, that we will be able in the future to bring forward the question of passengers' rights, both in aviation but also in other modes of transport, and I think that in a combined way. Last remark, my apology, because I have another commitment previously already committed to, so I will leave. Please don't consider that as disrespect to you or to the issue, which I think is a serious one. Thank you.
Thank you. On behalf of GUE, Mr. Carthy, for 1 minute.
Mr President, Ryanair deliberately misled customers concerning their rights as passengers under EU regulations. They refused to disclose correct information on compensation rights until its hand was forced. But we shouldn't be surprised by Ryanair's disrespectful behaviour towards its passengers. For years, its CEO has prided himself on the company's disrespectful treatment towards its workers. Ryanair refuses to negotiate with trade unions, it forbids its workers on many bases from organising. And remember, this debacle of cancelled flights is the direct result of pilots and other workers fleeing Ryanair. So the episode demonstrates that promoting so-called competitiveness to the detriment of workers' rights cannot and will not succeed. Therefore, we across the EU institutions have to stop pushing ahead with our aggressive competition agenda in the transport sector and acknowledge first and foremost that flights cannot run, planes cannot fly if we do not have pilots and workers to service them.
Thank you very much indeed. For 1 minute now, Mrs. Deli for the Greens.
Colleagues, cancellation of flights by Ryanair are another provocation by this low-cost airline. 400,000 passengers have been penalised because of bad management, bad planning. That's a joke. This company has simply treated passengers abysmally, and I am going to say what I think. It's not low cost, it's zero service. And in the face of these kind of actions, I would call on the European Commission to ensure that Ryanair lives up to European legislation when it comes to passengers' rights, but at the same time we have to think about sanctions. It's not going to stop here. Ryanair has just announced the cancellation of 18,000 further flights up to March next year, and that just shows the limits of this low-cost model, which is neither good for the planet, nor for the workers, nor for the consumers. And it is high time that the European Union takes note of that and ceases to encourage low-cost, the social dumping and the subsidies that they benefit from. So let us beef up passengers' rights, let us make it clear, but let's also create a sanction mechanism that would bring hooligan companies to book.
Thank you. On behalf of EFDD, Mrs. D'Amato, also for 1 minute.
Thank you, President. Yes, this is a scandal because more than 21,000 flights have been cancelled. Millions of passengers are still on the ground or stuck in remote areas and islands. Why? Because this gentleman has built up a monopoly at the cost of our citizens. Taxpayers because regions and municipalities pay Ryanair to keep flights going in their areas. Citizens, consumers are supposed to be protected, but they need some compensation, not just a refund. And be careful about the rights of the workers too. We want to understand whether the rest periods being proposed by the firm is actually in line with full respect for their physical and mental health. You can't just allow them to go faster. It's mismanagement by a company, okay, but it's above all a market concern here that they've been wanting to grab slots and put other smaller firms out of business, and to heck with us as the citizens.
Thank you. Mr. Korwin-Mikke, non-attached for 1 minute.
10 days ago, my flight was suddenly cancelled, and I only got €200 because they told me that I wasn't eligible for more. Well, if I have a problem, it's my problem, and if a million people have a problem, it's all their respective individual problems. So if now Ryanair wants to give those passengers to other airlines, it's their right. Ryanair is entitled to actually cancel half their flights. When Ryanair does fly, it's all a huge crime. If they don't, it's also a crime. So there is no reason for any institution to interfere with autonomous decision of an enterprise. So if I were Ryanair, I would say the institutions to go away. And also I think that the European Union should be abolished. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Koch, 1.5 minutes.
Liebe Frau Kommissarin Bulc.
Commissioner Bulc, over 300,000 Ryanair clients have been affected by cancellations through to March 2018. It will be 400,000 further customers. For all the reasons that Ryanair has given for delays, etc., I cannot accept any of those. The decisive question now is whether, in the case of this marathon of cancellations, the rights of passengers are being upheld or not. That's why I would call on all passengers affected to make sure they avail themselves of their right and to push them through under national legislation. And if the information is incorrect or incomplete on the Ryanair website, well, it's the company that must bear responsibility for that. You could be reimbursed 250 to 600 euros depending on the length of the journey, and they're supposed to and that would be if you couldn't get reasonable rerouting. When it comes to the future conduct of the company, I don't feel very confident, and it's just another reason why the Council of Transport Ministers should think once again about the regulation adopted by this House or proposed by this House in 2014 that blocked in Council. We do now urgently need that reform, and to make this a more effective way in which to ensure that passengers' rights are upheld.
Thank you. Mrs. Ayala Sender for 1 minute.
Gracias, President.
Thank you, President. Well, yes, we are here complaining rightly about the loss of the rights of 400,000 passengers. The company right now is launching an attack of 1 million places as well for the coming months, and a price which is absolutely disgraceful. At the same time, it's leaving 400,000 people on the ground, and at the same time, as a way of propaganda, it's launching its campaign for seats for the next months. So it's some kind of perverse financial engineering, and so I think we have to do something about this company, because it's fooling the passengers. Its organisation could not get any worse, and its forecasts are totally unacceptable, and it's ill-treating the pilots. It criticises them, it cocks a snook at them as well, and that's why, Madam Commissioner, I would ask you not only about the specific sanctions we can implement, so that we can do something about this at European level, because there are certain companies asking one thing, others another, and so we don't really know what the final sanction will be. And also we have to make it easier to complain. From a digital point of view, every passenger, at the time they actually pay for or buy a flight, they should be informed about their rights and how they can automatically complain to the company. Thank you. Thank you. For 1 minute, Mrs. van Boyshout.
Voorzitter, beste commissaris.
Thank you, President. Commissioner, I find it extremely regrettable that we're only debating this issue now. More than a year ago, I'd already put a question to the Commission regarding complaints from customers against Ryanair and its failure to comply with rules for consumers. The reply I received from your service at the time was that there was nothing going on. On the 4th of July this year, I again asked you to take steps against airlines who are making it virtually impossible to lodge a complaint. Once again, I got an answer from you that you would look into it. Now thousands of consumers have been affected. I hope that you will, at long last, actually take steps. As a result of the Ryanair case, you've already reacted in the press to the effect that companies must respect European rules. But the rules are already there, and primarily it's for the member states to enforce them and for the Commission to appoint the member states to that duty. So I do hope that at long last you will finally do something about this and make sure that the companies do live up to their responsibilities.
Thank you. Mr. van Mittelberg, 2 minutes.
Thank you, President. Commissioner and Council Representative too. We're talking here about transporting customers safely to their destinations. It's not our job to enter into legal procedures with an airline cancelling flights at short notice. The right to alternative flights, care and information. Their rights as passengers, that's what's at stake. Once upon a time, Europe had the ambition to protect passengers against unfair practices. We had the intention to help passengers to uphold their rights. We had a proposal for passengers' rights in aviation to be strengthened. That amendment of Regulation 216 of 2004 has constantly been ordered because the aviation world has changed so much over the years. Passengers have to have an extended right to an alternative flight. They need better information from the airlines. Misleading and non-transparent information is something there should be no scope for in my Europe. Protecting passenger rights is something that's got stuck on the Council's table, that amendment of 216/2004. Now, we take passengers' rights seriously, but the Council and the Member States for 3 years now have refused to address this with us. And that, of course, is because of differences regarding the status of Gibraltar's airspace. Now, despite the complexities of Brexit, something has to be done. You can overcome personal dramas as a result of cancellations and work together with us in the European Parliament to ensure that airline passengers, at long last, can get a soft landing. Thank you.
Thank you. For 1.5 minutes, Mrs. Keelan.
Dear Chair, dear colleagues, passengers' and workers' rights need to be respected. This is unfortunately not the case for Ryanair. This kind of unfair business models, ultra-low cost models in the transport sector in general needs to be avoided. If you look at the current situation for customers, no real safeguards exist against flight cancellations or delays. How do passengers really feel when they took a Ryanair flight but they don't know whether it will ever take off, and then the company blames poor planning of staff holidays. It is not only the customers who are affected, it is also the crew members who work on hourly rate and don't get paid when flights get cancelled. What are the workers' social conditions if they are only being paid for the hours you are flying with no income security when flights are cancelled? Is this the model of aviation we want in Europe or elsewhere, a new model of legal slavery? We need to fix the grey areas of the current air passenger right regulation. We know very well the regulation is open for interpretations, and Parliament is ready and willing to get an agreement on this important subject. We need a clear and fair air passenger rights regulation, and the citizens of Europe are waiting for European Union leadership in this matter. Fair conditions, fair aviation, safe to the customers and safe to the workers.
Σας ευχαριστώ. Το λόγο έχει για
Thank you. For 1 minute, Mr. Dalunde.
Tack, herr talman.
Thank you, Mr. President. Ryanair recently announced that they will be cancelling a large number of flights through to March 2018, which will affect hundreds of thousands of travellers. This is very unfortunate, and it is an expression of Ryanair's very problematic business model, which is based on working conditions that are undignified for the workers and playing off one airport against another. Now, there is a problem with the climate, and it also affects passengers, as I've said. That's not acceptable. So hundreds of thousands of travellers, given that they will be affected, this requires us to strengthen legislation so that cabin crew have reasonable conditions and passengers can book their flights securely. They need to pay for damage to the environment, and this kind of activity has to stop. Thank you.
Thank you. Mrs. Ayuto, 1 minute. Thank you. Over the last 15 years, various governments in member states have sold the European skies, lining the pockets of the Irish company. And there has been aid also to the operating of minor airports in particular, in order to keep up passenger levels as well. And that was behind the rules on competition. Various member states have allowed the proliferation of this air company. And having for years given virtually free flights throughout Europe, we know who was paying for that. Ryanair now is struggling, but it's not only the national governments that are responsible for this current crisis. How many times has the Commission washed its hands of the many violations mentioned by this Parliament? How often has it refused our questions about illegal state aid, pushing the responsibility to national courts? For 20 years the European Union has left the workers in limbo. For 20 years each state has been interpreting those rules as it feels fit. And at the cost of your indifference now, the passengers are now paying. They've gone up in smoke with a click, and workers in the sector are not only those in the low-cost area, they're always the mainline airlines as well. Thank you. Thank you. For 1.5 minutes now, Mr. Salini.
Grazie, Presidente. Buonasera, Commissario.
Thank you, President. Good evening, Commissioner. I must say that I've been very struck by the course of the debate regarding the Ryanair scandal. The reason I've been struck by this is that within Parliament, and in my committee, the Industry Committee, as well as the Transport Committee, we often find ourselves debating how we can protect the European market and the high performance of our firms in terms of protecting the market, the working conditions of workers and passengers in this instance. We're protecting ourselves from those who are outside the market, failing to respect the rules of competition, in other words. And we're quite right to do all this. In this instance, we find ourselves in a paradoxical situation since, as usual, when we're talking about companies, we have the customers, the workers and the firm itself. As far as the passengers are concerned, with plenty of scope to protect their rights, the workers have taken this to court. The court has given a ruling So they have every prospect of ensuring that their work is protected and that they can work in circumstances which allow them to offer a proper service. Well, now let's look at the actual firm. I don't tend to jump the gun in putting people in the dock, but when you have a company which has created conditions of unfair competition, conning passengers and cutting down workers' conditions, can we still say that Europe is the greatest market in the world? If we have the greatest market in the world, all these factors have to be borne in mind, and that doesn't appear to have been the case here.
Thank you. Mrs. Revaud-Dallon for 1 minute.
Mr. President, Commissioner, it's not the first time, unfortunately, that the antisocial practices of Ryanair have been brought to our attention, and once again we're calling out the abusive practices of this company when it comes to not respecting passenger rights. Thousands of flights cancelled. The consequence of not taking into account pilots' off downtime, and it's an economic model which pushes workers to their limits. It's workers' rights and passenger rights that are two sides of the same coin when it comes to improving service, and it's the European Union that is able to act on that. In 2014, this Parliament adopted a proposal for regulation to extend passenger rights when it comes to compensation and assistance, and it is high time that the Council should adapt its position so that that new regulation could come into force. Secondly, in line with the ruling of the Court of Justice of the 4th of September against Ryanair, it is indispensable for the main place of activity to be defined so that companies can employ their personnel in a proper way, and European legislation must consolidate their decision on that so as better to protect those workers.
Thank you. For 1 minute, Mr. Marias. Thank you, President. Well, it's illogical and unacceptable how Ryanair has behaved. 400,000 passengers have been left up to their fate. It's already cancelled flights, and apparently it's going to continue to cancel by the spring. The Ryanair is the biggest airline. It works in 84 airports, and unfortunately it has a monopoly. That's the state of affairs, and it uses that condition of a monopoly to make profit, and all of that because there is a mismatch basically in its links with the pilots. It doesn't respect their rights. The pilots are not ready then to work excessive hours, and the same applies for the cabin staff as well. So what measures is the Commission going to take against Ryanair, which is breaking the law basically? How are we going to protect the pilots? How are we going to protect the consumer? What about the compensation? These are the questions to which we have to find answers so that Ryanair can stop this despotic stance on the markets right now. Everything that's happened has happened because they were aiming at excessive profits, and of course they didn't give 1 penny to its own workers. That's the real state of affairs. Thank you very much indeed. Mrs. Meissner for 1 minute.
Mr. President, Commissioner, colleagues, Ryanair has announced 98% of passengers that have been affected by cancellations September or October have actually had their money back or had rebooked their flights. Now, you might have got the impression that what they'd done was brilliant, but the problem is that they didn't tell the passengers of all the options that were available to them. It's not just a question of getting money back in the case of cancelled flights, but of compensation. Our colleague was mentioning, Mr. Koch, 253 to 600 euros depending on the length, and you are required as an airline company to book even onto more expensive routes. So I think it's a good thing that the Aviation Authority has finally basically forced Ryanair to clarify all this information. The point is that if you behave in that manner, it's no surprise that many people are saying that you need to have a tightening up of passenger rights, air passenger rights, and Van Mittenburg just said that we could have better flight passenger rights, but they're blocked in council, and now we need to ensure that these air passengers can have their rights maintained and can rely on the airlines.
Thank you. For 1 minute, Mr. Pimentel Lopez.
Thank you, President. It's not just passengers' rights at stake here. You cannot separate this case out from the policy options imposed on this sector by the EU, such as a systematic recourse to privatisation, destroying national flag carriers. There's been concentration in this sector and been very permissive approach towards low-cost operators with deregulation of workers' conditions, forcing down wage costs, undermining national sovereignty even more. That's the root of the problem. The workers reached the outer limits of the deplorable conditions imposed on them by Ryanair. Everyone in the transport sector is fighting for dignified working conditions. We need to turn around the policy options and make sure the strategic sector becomes once again a public sector. That's vital for any country. That's the only way of ensuring best practice for workers and keeping the sector operating properly.
Thank you very much indeed. Mr. Kramer, for 1 minute.
Frau Präsidentin, meine lieben Kolleginnen und Kollegen.
President, colleagues, 18,000 flights have been cancelled. 800,000 clients almost have been affected, and existing legislation has been violated. We could tighten it up, but this has already happened. And I think it's those that break the law must be punished, not customers, as Ryanair has done. A colleague was telling me how it works. Wanted to fly to Frankfurt. The flight was cancelled. No text message, no email, no food compensation, a hotline number which took 3 hours. You can only be rebooked on a Ryanair flight several weeks later. Everything was overbooked. There was no compensation for hotel or reimbursement. And when they finally got through, they said you didn't have Ryanair flight insurance, so you're not going to get any money. They knew exactly what they were doing. They broke the law. We must not accept that. A law that is not followed needs to be sanctioned, and if that isn't the case, that's not a good law. The Commission needs to pay attention to that, and the Member States and the organisations must pursue them. Customers have priority, and not the exploitation of them by Ryanair, the exploitation of their pilots by Ryanair, and there haven't been sufficient pilots who've been able to do it, and this phony self-employment needs to be looked into. The wage dumping, that has to stop, otherwise we're going to lose our credibility here in Europe.
Thank you. For 1.5 minutes, Mrs. Lukaszewska.
During this debate, we hear a lot of questions and doubts that are being expressed in this room. We hear about passenger rights, but also the responsibility of the company, which is trying to drive down the cost and the prices of the air tickets, has cancelled thousands of flights and also suspended flights on 34 routes for the winter period. Madam Commissioner, what will be the responsibility for what will be the consequences for this company? Thousands of passengers have not been able to take their flights, and we do not know whether they are aware of their rights, whether they are aware of the compensations and also the possibilities of rerouting at the expense of Ryanair. It is also important for us to look at the situation of the staff within this company. Why has it happened at all? Why has it happened that so many pilots have decided not to work for Ryanair anymore? We have held a number of discussions here at the European Parliament. We talked about social dumping and the remuneration and working time of drivers, truck drivers. How does that relate to Ryanair's staff? And how does this translate into the price of tickets? How is it possible for anybody to pay €2 or €3 for an air ticket? Are we not talking about social dumping here? How is it possible that so many out of the 13,000 employees are in fact self-employed? They do not get paid annual leave. They do not receive social support or any social benefits. I hope that the European Commission will be able to look into that and make sure that this company adheres to the regulations of the European law.
Thank you very much indeed. Mrs. De Monte for 1 minute. Thank you very much indeed. I'm a member of the Transport Committee and I'm very conversant with what we're debating today. Providing competitive costs in order to develop tourism, and that's something that we're happy to see. But to be a leader in the aviation sector, it's not enough to have a large slice of the market. You need also to respect workers' rights and the rights of passengers. Now, there are legitimate doubts about this, and that's why it is urgent that the Commission should shed the necessary light on this as quickly as possible. We're talking about pilots not getting their holidays. Are we sure that these are the real reasons, that there aren't other underlying reasons? When flights are cancelled, the rules are clear. We should see compensation to cover all the costs, but also we need to continue to work on the passengers' rights regulation. It's been stuck since 2014 on the Council table. We have to provide greater protection for passengers, which is in line with the times. Thank you. Thank you very much indeed. Mrs. Bilbao Barandica for 1 minute.
Thank you, President. Good evening, Commissioner. The massive cancellation of Ryanair flights gives us an opportunity to show the worth of competition, of cooperation amongst all the stakeholders. The member states have to carry out enforcement, but the Commission must make sure that everyone's singing from the same hymn book and applying the rules in the same way. With more than 400,000 people affected, you should ensure that in a simple way, nothing much more than a PDF, you could have a form available in all member states in all the languages. Customers who buy the Ryanair tickets mainly online can compare on the official information with what the company is telling them and make sure that consumers get all their rights and are properly informed. It's also a good time to take a fresh look at this company's models. Some less than transparent organisations a few years ago led to a number of firms offering services in the same way.
Mrs. González Peñas for 1 minute. Thank you very much indeed. 18,000 flights, 34 routes and 400,000 passengers affected in 4 months. If we were talking about a public company, basically we know what would happen and those responsible would have had to resign already. But because this is a company with a long history of cancellations and lack of protection for its passengers and the workers, well, apparently we resign to it and we say it's due to a small company and the pilots want to go on holiday. But Ryanair is a company that carries most passengers in Europe, and we should call for the maximum levels of responsibility. These irregularities should be investigated by European aviation authorities, and the regulation from 2004 on passenger rights sets minimums in respect of cancellations, information, compensation, alternatives, and Ryanair hasn't respected that. This is opening a Pandora's box, and the Commission has been trying to keep this under wraps, talking about the question of liberalisation of the aviation sector. We are very concerned. They're more concerned about the legislation rather than the rights of passengers. And we've seen these massive cancellations. Things would change if the Commission actually travelled low cost? Thank you very much indeed. For 1.5 minutes, Mr. van der Kamp.
Thank you very much, President. In the Netherlands, we have a wonderful proverb, pride comes before a fall. And Ryanair always made much of the fact that it was the largest airline carrying the most tourists, but in practice it seems to be a lot more difficult actually to get all those people in a proper way to their destinations. And that in itself is a serious state of affairs, particularly if they're advertising themselves as heavily as they have been. But now I do trust that Ryanair is going to provide proper compensation and not get people tied up in lots of online bureaucracy, but simply provide people with the compensation they deserve. Picking up what Mr. Ertug said, where was the Irish regulator? It surely cannot be the situation that Ryanair is being protected by the Irish supervisor. I hope the Commission has a clear response on this. We have the supervisory authorities and they have to do their job. Then in the Council, the passenger rights regulation has been stuck on the Council table for the last 3 or 4 years. You can cry as many crocodile tears as you like, but we need to solve that problem. In the Council, Estonia could play a very useful role. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Mr. Liberatsky for 1 minute.
Thank you very much, President. Madam Commissioner, I think we are having a debate where somebody may be sitting on the side and just laughing at us, and who I mean is the very exceptional manager and CEO of Ryanair. Well, first of all, these are the fruit of no penalties, and then the fruits of the current rules, and also the fruits of the games between Commission and Member States, and basically trying to get Ryanair everywhere. What was being sold was an illusion. What they were doing was selling an illusion, and this should not be allowed. So we are in a dilemma, because I would say that it's Ryanair that's turning their back on passengers and not the other way around, because I'm afraid that if the flights remain as cheap as they used to be, the passengers will come back. But, Madam Commissioner, this is Ryanair. Have you checked the other low-cost airlines? Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Kouloglou, for 1 minute. 3 points, Mr. Commissioner. First and foremost, the cancellation of tens of thousands of flights shows a lack of respect for passengers, a lack of respect which has been expressed in different terms. The head of Ryanair has said that, well, passengers, they should stand up to travel. We've heard that in the past. Secondly, in all of the EU member states where Ryanair is active, they should ensure that workers' rights and labour legislation is respected. And thirdly, we've got this lack of respect, as I say, vis-à-vis the passengers. You treat them like animals, have them standing up. Also, if we don't have rules for human labour, well, that affects the safety of flights. These airplanes are flying, they are engines, but they're also people. If you've got a happy, rested crew, then the passengers are going to be safe. And if that's not the case, then we're going to run the risk of having very sad news, and we'll all be responsible for that. You've sensed the climate here, Commissioner. It's at high time that measures were adopted. Thank you very much indeed. Mr. Billet for 1.5 minutes.
Thank you, President. Commissioner, good evening. The point has already been made, but the way Ryanair has acted on consumers' rights, it's trampled underfoot, is quite unprecedented. After lengthy hesitation and under great pressure from the media and the political sphere, the company has finally decided to provide compensation to customers. It is quite an unacceptable approach. We must make it crystal clear that passengers, if the flights are cancelled late in the day, are entitled, on top of that, to compensation. The Belgian Consumer Affairs Minister has launched an inquiry into Ryanair because of unfair trading practices, and I think the Commission should follow that example. Sent your colleague a letter about Ryanair. I think you need to be more decisive in your action and put Ryanair on the spot. Another point, we also need to work to ensure that the national mediators work better so that they're more accessible. People who have been conned, passengers can be given redress quickly and have easy access to the rights that European regulations give them. Thank you.
Thank you. For 1 minute, Mrs. Senalova.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Madam Commissioner, distinguished colleagues. When Ryanair pointed out that it would have to cancel up to 50 flights a day, it affected hundreds of thousands passengers, and that also had effects on the employees of the company. The company promised to provide compensation to affected passengers, but it did not allude to the possibility of rerouting, i.e. letting them fly with somebody else on the same date. Yet this is embedded in the regulation on the rights of passengers in aviation, debated back in 2014. And it remained blocked in the Council. The appeal to the Council to make an agreement on that is very timely. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Coelho, 1.5 minutes.
Thank you, President. Colleagues, thousands of flight cancellations by Ryanair have caused serious damage to European consumer confidence. Many consumers have reported that information on their rights has been consistently concealed, and many complaints made to airlines, national authorities and consumer associations, as well as the Commission, mentioned the following: lack of response, failure to implement the rules of Article 5 of Regulation 261/2004, provision of misleading information on compensation, or the use of loopholes in the regulation regarding connecting flights. It's a sorry state of affairs that 3 national authorities are the only ones who have threatened penalties. The others are just monitoring the situation. Support has mainly come from consumer organisations, and the Commission has not spoken out clearly enough here. Effective protection of consumers is vital for the smooth working of the market. Poor management by a company cannot be an excuse for evading the duty to provide compensation as well as refunds to passengers affected. From information I've received, we're looking here at misleading trading practices because of the failure to provide affected consumers with the information they need to assert their rights. The Commission cannot stand back when you have millions of Europeans being affected. When we proposed enhancing cooperation amongst national consumer protection authorities, our case was borne out by what has now happened, and we'll be voting on that in Strasbourg here next month.
Thank you very much indeed. For 1 minute, Mrs. Kaswanda-Heinz.
Herr Präsident, Frau Kommissarin, werte Kollegen.
Mr. President, Commissioner, colleagues, we see the shadow side of the low-cost airline industry. The price is this mentality of greed. 700,000 passengers who have been affected by cancellations. The information requirement to passengers is something that Ryanair, I don't think, has lived up to. At the same time, the cancellation of flights has had massive losses of income for the staff. Obviously, if you were a plane on the ground, it's not earning money. We hear about problems with holiday period planning, and yet it comes down to manning, and they will run 0 hours contracts, and we're in a very precarious employment situation. So Ryanair and other low-cost airlines have to think about entering into a fairer type of employment conditions when they carry out their everyday operations.
Thank you. Mr. Arimont for 1.5 minutes. Thank you very much indeed, President, Commissioner, colleagues. And I'm talking directly to the head of Ryanair, Mr. O'Leary. Imagine, Mr. O'Leary, you'd booked a flight with Ryanair, for example. And in London, Paris, Tallinn, you've booked a nice hotel. or you had an important professional deadline, and suddenly a day before, or even on the very day that you're travelling, you're told that the flight's not leaving, it's been cancelled. O'Leary, I think you would swear like Captain Haddock, and I think that will be the same for everyone who's had to experience that now. We've heard about 400,000 people. Add another 300,000 to that. In my own small constituency, a lot of furious citizens have called me and protested and asked, what's Europe doing about this? Or what can I, as somebody who's been affected as a citizen, do? Well, the answer is here in the regulation from 2004, establishing passenger rights. They're good rights. The passengers should call for these rights to be implemented, and these last-minute cancellations, where it's just sheer and absolute cheek. It's not okay. The costs for these cancelled flights have to be supported by Ryanair, and you, Commissioner, you must really call Mr. O'Leary to book for this. Free skies, well, okay, that's fine, but there have to be limits to bad planning. It's in your hands, Madam Commissioner. Look at what's happening, and I should call on all of the passengers to call for their money. Exercise your rights, because every time you exercise the rights, you're avoiding something similar happening again in the future. Thank you. Thank you very much indeed. Mr. Caputo, for 1 minute.
Thank you, President. The cancellation of flights right across Europe by Ryanair is creating great unease amongst European citizens. I think the roots of this are the social dumping to the cost of the company's employees. It's thereby trying to undermine competition. You could just recall that just yesterday, Monarch Airlines, a British low-cost company, it's been flying since 1978, went bankrupt. We need to take a fresh look at the internal market here. It's Europe's job to protect passengers. The airlines have to inform passengers properly. Whenever Ryanair cancels flights between 48 hours and 6 hours before departure, I don't think that's enough prior warning. As well as a refund, the real sticking point is compensation for late cancellation. Ryanair has the duty to respond automatically to that, and the consumer should not bear any cost for pressing this claim.
Thank you. Mrs. Grappini, 1 minute.
Thank you, President. Commissioner, dear representatives of Council, you have a unanimity in the Parliament. All political groups support the same thing. They pointed the finger to Ryanair. I think they defy us. It's impossible to reason to say that you cancelled hundreds, thousands of flights because you haven't planned well the vacations of pilots. I think this company is shameful. We need to find solutions. We need to increase the exigencies for the rights of consumers. I'm a member of the TRAN committee and the IMCO committee. Myself and all the other colleagues are sent here by the citizens in order to defend their rights, including those passengers' rights. Ryanair operates in my country as well, has 21 flights in my country. Citizens in my country have been affected. I think we have said enough. I don't think we need any more arguments to say that this company mocks us. It's not a management problem. It's theft. It's qualified theft, and we need to put a stop to it. And I need to tell colleague Liberatsky that the rights of passengers are infringed upon by other companies, but we need to verify all those companies. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Baillet, 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. President. Well, Madam Commissioner, low-cost airlines have generated thousands of jobs and developed certain regions, and where I'm from, Charleroi Airport is one of the biggest economic success stories in Belgium in recent years. But we have to look at things along the lines of what has been defined by Europe and what has to go hand in hand with that development. passenger rights have to be completely protected. The regulation is clear on that. Any company that cancels a flight has to inform passengers their rights, and they have to be compensated under certain conditions. And, Madam Commissioner, I think you need to take an initiative to ensure that the procedure for compensation is done correctly, and Ryanair's example has shown that this doesn't work. Secondly, rerouting needs to be done properly. There's also national labour law that comes in. We need to make sure that provisions are applied correctly, and these are the two elements that need to be looked at.
Thank you. That concludes the list of speakers, and then we now move on to Catch the Eye. 8 people have asked for the floor. I will accept all 8 because the timing is not too bad thus far. And obviously this is a very important issue which is up for debate. Mr. Novakov is the first speaker for 1 minute.
Mr. Chairman, I think there was much more emotion in this debate, more than we needed. There is no crisis that could not find a solution, but the shrill populism is not the way to solve it. Cooperation and dialogue with Ryanair is the way. Prompt clarification of the rights of passengers. It's amazing to find out that there are still people who are not aware of their rights, and this is our duty, to present to them this information in an accessible language. It's surprising that it's a mass practice by Avio, by companies, to inform their passengers via email. We are duty-bound to make it clear to the passengers what are their rights, because the damages are the collateral damage is much greater than the cost of a flight. Accommodation, hotels, failed business meetings. This crisis will blow over, but others will follow, which is to show that we have a serious problem. We must reform consumer protection. We must clarify their rights in the best possible way. Thank you.
Novakov, you have a blue card from...
Imate sine karta od...
Es geht nicht darum, dass die
It's not a question of passengers not knowing the rights that they've got, even if they know them and they want to pursue them. Ryanair has, they're the ones that know the rules and the rights, but they don't want to uphold them. That's the problem. It's not the incompetence of passengers here, it's the brutal way in which Ryanair has acted against the rights of passengers who are demanding their rights. This is what we reject. That's the scandal. It's not the fact that passengers don't know it.
You have 30 seconds.
If you're right, Mr. Kramer, and there are cases when a company has abused its rights and has infringed upon the rights of its passengers. But this is why we have a system and a procedure. People should know where to go and where to present their claim. Otherwise, what do? We protect any company that has abused the procedure. People should know what they are supposed to do in any circumstance, and if they should seek their rights, and if somebody has abused them, he should pay for that.
Mr. Chani, you have the floor for 1 minute.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Airlines' operational measures cannot be influenced, but in every circumstance they must act along the high standards of consumer protection rules established by the EU. Therefore, the failure to inform passengers, or rather the disinformation of passengers, as it happened in the case of Ryanair, is unacceptable. After announcing thousands of flights cancellations, Ryanair failed to inform passengers on several occasions that they have an option to be rerouted on other airlines where there is no suitable Ryanair service available within a reasonable time frame. This kind of disinformation has negative consequences beyond the damages of the given case. When consumers are misled in such a way, it discourages them from seeking access to their rights and destroys the enormous work dedicated to the empowering of EU consumers. Ryanair must answer its legal obligations and act in compliance with the EU rules, which means it must take responsibility for the rerouting of passengers on other airlines as well. However, we must not forget about the damage done on the field of consumer rights awareness. Thank you, sir.
Σας ευχαριστώ. Το λόγο έχει για ένα λεπτό η κυρία Λόπες Μπερμούδez.
Thank you. Mrs. Lopez Bermejo for 1 minute.
Thank you, President. The Ryanair crisis was not a result just of poor organisation on the part of the company. There's a lot more to it than that. What we have here is a company which hiring practices are the most damaging in the whole sector. And that's why more than 140 pilots working for this Irish firm have left it. More than 70% of Ryanair's pilots are made up of false self-employed people with no right to sick leave or proper holidays. Their rest periods are not respected. In order to work, they are forced to open up a false firm under Irish law so that the low-cost company doesn't have to pay taxes. That's what's led us to this crisis, where hundreds of thousands of consumers have been hit. It's not a problem with management, but rather degrading labour practices and the permissiveness on the part of the European authorities.
Thank you. Mr. Soltis for 1 minute.
Hvala za besedo. Torej, kako daleč gre lahko gospodarska
Thank you for giving me the floor. How far can a company go in their seeking of profit? Can they also include using of pilots, crews of airplanes and their exploitation because they're putting them into a status which is completely against all legal standards and rules? Is it justified? Is it also justified to cancel flights and damage passengers by doing so? So can we use different arguments to justify that? But there is also the question of security and safety, and if they're talking about expenses of 50 million euro and then they say that that will not affect their profit, then all this means that it pays to act in such a way, and we should do something about it and regulate these things and also adopt sanctions. And good evening to you, Madam Commissioner.
Thank you. Mr. Anna, 1 minute.
I apologise that I was delayed getting to this debate, Mr. President, but it's Ryanair, so I suppose that being late is quite fitting. Are we really surprised that we're here debating Ryanair, the airline that charges you 50 quid to check in at the airport? I mean, seriously, could you imagine if any other business made its customers' lives a misery on purpose? Imagine if it was someone like McDonald's and they charged you extra to have a cup for your drink or to carry your food on a tray. And now we've got planes with no pilots because they treat their pilots in the same way that they treat their customers. And there is not the slightest hint that they give a stuff about their customers. On a serious note, the Irish government needs to pull their finger out and do something about it. And the worst part of it all is that Ryanair love it. They love the rumours about standing room on planes or charging to go to the toilet because they see criticism as free advertising. Ryanair literally want to charge you for absolutely everything. And frankly, they'll probably want to charge us for Brexit as well. Now hang on, that's the European Union.
Σας ευχαριστώ. Το λόγο έχει...
Thank you. Mr. Ferrier for 1 minute.
Obrigado, Sr. Presidente. Sra. Comissária.
Thank you, President. Commissioner, as the Council representative said, air transport is one of the main means of communication and vectors of development for any modern country. Ryanair, one of the main airlines in Europe, cancelled thousands of flights, causing millions worth of damage to its customers. Colleagues, any operator in European airspace, as the Commissioner quite rightly said, must respect European legislation. Passenger rights must be scrupulously defended and protected. There have to be proper penalties, and hefty ones at that, in my view. Commissioner, liberalising airspace shouldn't have led to too far west conditions. The Commission has to take a firm hand to this and stop this violation of passengers' rights by Ryanair if there's any repetition of this. This is damaging national economies. Those who break the rules, Commissioner, should not be allowed to operate in European airspace. Thank you.
You have a blue card from Mr. Gericke. Do you accept it?
Herr Faria, eine ganz kurze Frage.
Very brief question. 800,000 passengers who, in a very short space of time, have had flights cancelled. Now, could you tell me how many passengers could actually get for 15 euros from Hamburg to Ukraine and really thought that that would cover the cost of the flight?
Caro colega, não percebi muito bem a sua pergunta.
I didn't quite grasp your question, colleague, but what I would say is that passengers are entitled to be compensated for the damage caused to them, whether it's 15 euros or whatever the sum may be. There are rules in legislation which stipulate the amount in terms of the hours of delay and cancellation. So this is nothing new. All we're calling for is for the rules which exist to be implemented. We have European legislation. It's there on the statute books, and it just has to be enforced. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Hatzigeorgiou for 1 minute. Commissioner, if we don't want to close our eyes to the Ryanair issue, we should understand that this problem has existed for many years. They're trampling workers' rights, not only those of the pilots, but of many workers as well. And the question now is what measures the Commission is going to adopt to compensate for the damage suffered by thousands of people, and what measures is it going to adopt to ensure that the company accepts its own responsibilities. Companies cannot work for so many years in this way, and we do nothing. We close our eyes. And then only discuss it when it's almost too late. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you. That takes us to the end of almost to the end of the Catch the Eye. The last speaker, Mrs. McGuinness.
Thank you, President. The last passenger, perhaps. Just to say that I'm sure Michael O'Leary, Chief Executive of Ryanair, is listening to this debate, and his ears are burning, and that may be no harm. And I hope he's heard the emotion of many colleagues in the Chamber who've expressed the upset to passengers, and that we need to take this on board. But Ryanair is a very large airline. The statistics, if you'll bear with me, 131 million customers this year, operating in 33 countries, an unblemished safety record of 32 years. But the cancellations were of such a scale that people did begin to question, was there more behind this than simply a rostering error? So Ryanair has work to do, and indeed on connecting with passengers they have work to do, as all airlines have. When there's a problem, we need to talk to a human being, and perhaps that's something we could stitch into a regulation. Two things: could the Commission study the follow-up of this crisis? How many people actually claimed their rights? Because I think it would be an exercise that would be useful to us to see if the legislation is working effectively. And last question, Commissioner, do you think there's a need for tightening up of the rules, or do you think everything is fine as we have it today? Thank you.
Thank you. Commissioner Bulc on behalf of the Commission.
President, honourable members, first let me thank you for this very rich debate, and I would like to assure you once more that the Commission will be in close contact with all national authorities and enforcement bodies concerned to make sure that European rules, including those on passengers' rights, are strictly respected. Let me now address some of your more specific questions. First, on social problems. I am not here to really speculate on the root causes of Ryanair's decision. At this stage, Ryanair has confirmed that this is solely due to rostering issues and management failure. European rules are really crystal clear. It is the responsibility of the Irish authorities to oversee Ryanair as an Irish airline. And I am confident that they are closely monitoring that Ryanair respects all its obligations. If they discover wrongdoing, I am also confident that they will act accordingly. On communication with stakeholders, information campaigns have been present since 2010, including videos, brochures, leaflets and so on since 2010. Interactive content is present on Year Europe. Coordination with NEPs, ensuring airlines provide info, a check-in online and at airports, is also ensured and present. And there are also mobile applications that the customers can download. Obviously, this still is not enough. I issue a special statement that, before every holiday, summer and Christmas, and we can still look at it if anything else can be done that people will learn about their rights. What were we doing on the social conditions? There were several questions regarding that. There are concerns regarding the development of social conditions of mobile workers in aviation, and I'm very committed to moving forward on the social dimension of aviation, and it will be the focus of my portfolio under the aviation strategy next year. As far as the state aid is concerned, the rules are the same for all airlines. My services will soon launch also a study on certain employment and social aspects, including bogus employment and alleged pay-to-fly schemes for pilots. Their purpose is to understand better the facts on the ground and how they relate to existing legal obligations and EU policy for the future. Our work will take into account the case law of the EU Court of Justice, including the recent one on the home base of air crews and the determination of the place of work. The next question was related to intervening and sanctioning Ryanair. And here, let me say the following. Member States have designed national enforcement bodies called NEPs, which are responsible for the enforcement of EU air passengers' rights. The sanctions for infringements of this regulation are laid down by Member States. For the time being, there is no reason to initiate any infringement procedures against Ireland, and as I said, I'm confident they will do the work that they have to do. And last but not least, EU safety rules. EU rules are the same for legacy and low-cost carriers. The EU has the highest aviation safety standards in the world, and I am also confident all national authorities follow this closely, including Ireland. So let the system do the job. President and honourable members, the single aviation market has propelled European mobility forward, bringing Europeans closer together and providing a solid foundation for more jobs and economic growth. Successful reforms played a key role here, and the Commission, along with national authorities, has and will ensure that these common rules are respected by all players, big or small. It is thanks to the EU that all passengers have a full set of rights when flying. This very unfortunate event has only further cemented the importance of these rules and the need for their full implementation. And it is in this spirit that I am inviting you to see the challenge in front of us as well, a challenge that we are actively addressing to the benefit of passengers. I can only hope that we can unblock the new proposal on passengers' rights in the Council and get it up and operational as an important tool for even stronger enforcement of passengers' rights. And I really welcome your support, honourable members, on this point. This is exactly why we put forward guidelines last year to provide clarity and certainty. And yes, I do travel low cost, as a Commissioner and as a private citizen.
Thank you. Now, on behalf of the Council, Mr. Masikas.
Thank you very much, President. Some speakers have referred to the revision of the current legislation, something that the Commission duly did propose in 2013 and we all know what the state of affairs is with this piece of legislation, and we also all know why is it that. The Council is, however, aware of its obligation, and I can, just like the Commissioner, I can only hope that this highly regrettable Ryanair case would also give incentives to the Member States concerned to reconsider their position so that we could adopt this set of new, stronger rules for the passengers' sake and for our citizens' sake. Meanwhile, the Ryanair case must be resolved. It must be resolved soon, and all affected passengers must be duly compensated. Secondly, the national enforcement bodies must do all they can to assist passengers affected and to ensure that EU airlines abide by their legal obligations in the future. And similarly, the EU airlines should be more proactive in providing clarity to their customers regarding the rules on compensation and assistance. The airlines are legally obliged to make passengers aware of their rights and should act accordingly. Thank you very much.
Thank you. That concludes the debate on this issue. The next item on our agenda is the objection pursuant to Rule 106, the draft Commission regulation amending Annex 2 to Regulation 1107 of 2009 by setting out scientific criteria for the determination